The desert evening unfurled like an old memory, warm and dusky, when Colt McGraw, age 30 and wearing the kind of loneliness a man pretends is dust, rode into Red Hollow with a tired horse and a heart he'd long since locked away. The sky burned copper, the wind hummed through the canyon grass, and for a moment he felt the world holding its breath, as if waiting for him to notice something he'd spent his whole life avoiding, and he almost kept riding. But the sound of a soft voice, steady and low, curved through the dusk like a thread catching on a frayed edge, making him look over his shoulder with an unease he didn't want to name. Elara Redbird, age 23, quiet as dawn over river water, knelt beside a trembling chestnut mare just outside the town's old corral. Her hands moved with a healer's certainty, pressing herbs into a salve, whispering breaths that soothed even the wind, and Colt felt something in his chest snag, as if the sight unsettled something he'd tried to bury. She didn't look at him at first, didn't ask permission to tend the wounded horse he'd all but given up on, and maybe it was that calm confidence that made him clear his throat with more force than sense. When she finally lifted her gaze, soft and steady, he felt exposed in a way that made him clench every muscle. So he said the first stupid thing pride placed on his tongue. "A woman like you could never win my heart," and the words hung heavier than he expected, especially when she blinked once, quietly, before returning to her work as though he hadn't spoken at all. He rode away from her then, straight-backed and self-righteous, but every hoof-beat echoed like a question he couldn't outrun, tightening around the ribs until he wished he'd kept his mouth shut. The fading light stretched her shadow across the dust behind him, long and slender, and he found himself glancing back more than once, wondering why the world suddenly felt changed in a way he couldn't explain, wondering why her silence hurt more than any retort she could have given. By the next morning, his words had traveled through Red Hollow, carried by gossip as casually cruel as desert wind against skin. Townsfolk whispered in doorways, judgment sharp as burrs under a saddle. Deputy Amos Crowley, broad-chested, narrow-souled, laughed loudest, claiming Elara had no place here, that she was a reminder of a past the town preferred to ignore. Colt overheard this as he tied his horse outside the general store, a prickle of shame crawling up his spine while Crowley mocked her heritage with a sneer sharp enough to cut rawhide. Colt stared at his boots, jaw locked, telling himself it wasn't his business, even as something hot and miserable twisted inside him, and he realized, too late, that silence made him feel dirtier than the insult he'd spoken the night before. Elara passed by during Crowley's tirade, her arms full of dried herbs, her eyes cast downward. She didn't flinch when Crowley tipped her basket, sending roots and petals scattering across the street like broken offerings. She simply knelt to gather them again with quiet dignity, the sun catching on her braid, turning its dark strands to river glass. Colt watched her, guilt dragging at him until he almost stepped forward, but pride welded his boots to the dirt, and when she rose without a single word, he felt a crack in his heart he had no name for. That night, a storm clawed its way across the plains, a violent, wind-borne thing that rattled even the bones of the earth. Colt sought refuge in an old abandoned barn on the edge of town, his horse limping from a fresh knock. The rain thundered overhead like 1,000 hooves, and the lantern's flame flickered uncertainly. He was binding the horse's leg when the door creaked open, and Elara stepped inside, droplets clinging to her lashes, her breath visible in the cold air. She froze when she saw him, but not out of fear, more like disappointment. He felt that clean through. She came not for him, but for wild sage growing along the barn's back wall, herbs she collected without looking his way until she noticed his horse trembling. For a breath she hesitated, then she set down her gathering and knelt with the same quiet purpose she'd shown the night before. Colt swallowed hard, humbled by the fact that she helped him after everything he'd said, and when she left without accepting thanks, slipping into the rain like a ghost of mercy he didn't deserve, he wondered why her absence felt louder than thunder. In the gray dawn that followed, he found himself at her home on the far side of Red Hollow, repairing the storm-damaged fence while no one watched. He did it clumsily, unfamiliar with apology in the shape of hammering nails. He left without knocking on her door, but that evening he discovered a small pouch of healing herbs tied to his saddle, the scent of sage and juniper rising like forgiveness he hadn't earned. Their silent exchange became a rhythm, a language without words, herbal salves left in his barn, wooden rails mended around her yard, soft glances traded when they crossed paths in town. But the whispers of the townsfolk rose too, sharp and poisonous, judging her ethnicity, judging his proximity, filling the air with the kind of scorn that gnawed at old wounds he thought long scarred over, and the more they judged, the more he found his eyes drifting toward her. One afternoon, Crowley cornered Alara again, this time at the marketplace, his tone oily as he accused her of trespassing on town property. He shoved her basket to the ground for show, herbs scattering across the dust. Before Colt could think, his boots were moving, his voice carrying over the crowd as he stepped between them, blocking Crowley's next grab. The onlookers stared as if the world had tilted sideways. Colt's anger trembled under his skin, quiet but lit like a furnace, and Crowley grinned, a thin, dangerous thing, but backed off with muttered threats. Alara gathered her herbs without looking at Colt, but he saw the faint tremor in her hands and wondered when he had started noticing every small, quiet thing about her. He returned to his cabin that night with thoughts he couldn't outrun. His father's voice haunted him still, "Love is weakness, boy. Mixing blood is shame you don't wash off," and Colt pressed his palms to his eyes, ashamed of how long he'd carried another man's fear. He remembered watching Alara earlier that day, teaching a crying child how to calm a frightened foal. She'd held the child like something precious, her murmured words soft as smoke. And Colt realized then, with painful clarity, that he'd never known tenderness like that, never allowed himself to believe he deserved it, never understood how much he needed it until he saw it walk the earth in the shape of her. Dusk found him on her doorstep with a small leather charm he'd carved, hands shaking slightly. It was nothing fancy, just a protective symbol he'd learned from an old trail hand, but he held it out like fragile truth. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his with a warmth that sent a shiver up his spine. He stammered through an apology, words failing him like they always did, but she studied his face with those still, patient eyes, and for the first time, she smiled at him, a slow, gentle curve that felt like sunlight through storm clouds, leaving him unable to breathe for a heartbeat. But peace never lasted in the West. Crowley cornered her again near the river 2 days later, this time away from watchful eyes. Colt was riding the ridge when he heard her startled cry, and instinct dragged him down the slope before thought caught up. He reached them just as Crowley seized her arm, accusing her of theft, fabricated charges to justify dragging her to the jailhouse. Colt shoved Crowley back, fury flashing white-hot, and Crowley's hand flew to his gun. Alara gasped. Colt lunged. The struggle was short, desperate, the river roaring beside them like a witness unwilling to intervene. Colt disarmed him with raw grit, sending the gun skidding across the stones. Crowley stumbled back, humiliated, swearing he'd finish what should have been done long ago, before disappearing into the trees like a storm biding its time. Colt's arm bled from a shallow cut he hadn't felt until Alara touched it. She led him to the riverbank, washing the wound with trembling fingers, her breath uneven. The closeness between them thrummed like a plucked string, soft, dangerous, necessary. Colt felt her fear, not of him, but of losing him, though she said nothing. He whispered her name like a vow, and she stilled, eyes shining with something that made his heart ache, a quiet longing that felt too sacred to disturb, and yet he felt himself leaning toward her warmth. Later that night, sitting on her porch under the lantern's glow, Colt spoke truths he'd never admitted aloud. He told her he'd been wrong about everything, about pride, about people, about the foolish armor around his heart. His voice cracked as he asked, "Would you let me walk beside you for as long as these plains stretch?" There were no grand speeches, no bold declarations, just vulnerability laid bare. Her hand rose to cover his, her eyes rimmed with soft tears, and she nodded once, slow and sure, leaving the world suspended in a breath between old pain and new beginning. Their wedding took place on Martha Delaney's homestead, a simple ceremony braided with both their cultures. Elara wore soft doeskin embroidered with river patterns. Colt wore a dusty suit scrubbed clean for the first time in years. A native elder offered blessings, Martha read vows in her soft trembling voice, and a few brave townsfolk attended despite the weight of their neighbors' disapproval. When Colt and Elara exchanged vows, their fingers entwined with a reverence that brought silence over the gathered crowd, and when they kissed, tentative at first, then sure, the wind rose warm through the cottonwoods as though the land itself approved, even if some people still didn't. Life after marriage unfolded gently, like pages turning in an old leather-bound book. They shared sunrise coffee in tin mugs on their porch, hands brushing lazily. They worked side by side in the barn, shoulders touching as they brushed down horses. Elara taught Colt her language, slow syllables whispered at night when the world felt soft and safe. He learned to say words of thanks, of affection, of hope. They danced barefoot in their cabin by candlelight, his hands on her waist trembling with the delicacy of a man who'd never held something so precious. They fell asleep each night tangled in warmth, Elara whispering stories of river spirits and sky paths, Colt listening like a man starved his whole life for tenderness, and yet even in this peace, a shadow lingered at the edge of their happiness. Crowley returned one moonless night, hatred boiling over into a final act of cowardice. Colt woke to the smell of smoke. Crowley had set their barn alight, flames licking high into the dark as horses screamed. Elara shook Colt awake, fear sharp in her eyes, and together they dashed into the night. Colt confronted Crowley not with violence but with truth. He hauled him before the gathering townsfolk drawn by the fire's glow, telling them what Crowley had attempted, what he had plotted for months. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily as Crowley sputtered excuses. But then Elara spoke, quiet, steady, fearless, and her words carried the weight of every injustice heaped upon her. The townsfolk listened, really listened, and something in them shifted. Crowley was seized, stripped of badge and power, sent from Red Hollow under guard, and in the settling quiet after his removal, Colt wrapped his arm around Elara, both of them shaking with relief as the barn's embers died down, leaving room at last for the rebuilding of more than just wood and beams. In the days that followed, neighbors who once whispered now offered help, hammering boards, hauling water, repairing fences, small acts of grace that felt like apology and acceptance combined. Colt and Elara rebuilt their barn together, their hands brushing amid the drifting sawdust, their laughter soft and healing. And as the foothills glowed gold beneath the rising sun, their home grew into a place of welcome for weary travelers, horsemen, widows, wanderers, drawn to the quiet peace the couple cultivated. Their love wove itself into the land, into the whispers of the plains, into every dawn that broke gently across their little homestead, leaving their names spoken with reverence long after the dust of conflict settled. And if you stand on that porch someday, listening to the wind rustle the grass where their footsteps once echoed, you might feel a warmth at your back, a reminder that hearts can change like shifting horizons, that love humbles even the proudest rider, that quiet kindness reshapes the world more deeply than any storm. And maybe, just maybe, you'll come to believe that the love you think you don't deserve has been riding beside you all along, waiting for the moment you finally turn to see it.